a real privilege in front of us to hear a great defender of the Christian faith in the last century and this century, a man who has marked many of us by his books and his lectures, Dr. Peter Kreeft. He was educated at Calvin College, and a graduate degree at Fordham University with a master's and PhD. I think he is a proved philosopher, Christian philosopher. I've often referred to him, I don't know if he would bear this title, but refer to him as our Christian apologist, which you've heard me say that I think we greatly need Christian apologists because our culture descends into the abyss the way that it seems to do so. And so it is a real honor to have him. I should tell you that the order of the sessions is going to reverse. What we planned on tomorrow with Charles Williams and so forth, Dr. Kreeft is actually going to give those lectures today, and the C.S. Lewis lectures tomorrow. And so let's welcome Dr. Peter Kreeft.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for all coming. The reason we're reversing the order is that I am a genuine certified excellent professor, and I left my notes for the C.S. Lewis book home, so I'm going to have to reconstruct it tonight. So we'll start with Charles Williams' delightful little tale, Descent into Hell. I chose to do 5 particular works rather than general themes, because I think teaching great books from the text, analyzing the text, is the very best way of teaching anything. And I chose to do some of the less famous works. For instance, I'm not doing the Chronicles of Narnia, but Lewis and Children Have Faces, and I'm not doing the Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien's Silmarillion. And Descent into Hell is one of the delightfully obscure novels of Williams. They're all obscure. My approach will not be scholarly. It will be popular. I'm not talking to scholars, I'm talking to readers. Some of you will have read these books before, some of you will have not read these books before. So for those who have not read these books before, this will be a sales presentation. Those who have read the book before, it will be a love affair. And I'll concentrate on a few big ideas in each book, rather than try to cover the whole waterfront, because that's all we can take home with us anyway. Our minds are rather small and capable of containing only a few ideas at a time. And finally, my philosophy of teaching is that the worst kind of teaching is monologue, a lecture, which I'm forced to engage in. A little better is dialogue, and even a lecture in dialogue with the author of the text. The best philosophy of teaching is a trialogue, where the professor's voice, the author's voice, and the student's voice are all heard. So to preserve order, since this is not a classroom, I won't interrupt myself and ask for questions every couple of minutes, but at the end, you are commanded to ask some questions, and if there are no questions, the meeting will begin. Whenever I assign this book, Charles Williams' Descent into Hell, in philosophy and literature classes, which I teach quite often, I always get from at least one student, sometimes quite a few students, the following reaction, which I never get to any other book. Professor, I know there's going to be a test on this, but I'm sorry, I just cannot finish the book. I was overcome by such a fear and such a feeling of dread that I think I may go insane if I finish the book. That's a rather extreme version of it. But this is the single most terrifying book I've ever read outside the Bible. By the way, Bible ought to come with warning labels. Why? Well, because it's about hell, and it makes hell quite believable. 5 basic dimensions of this story. The first dimension is the characters, because the story has to be about a person, otherwise it's boring. And the second dimension is the setting. It has to be somewhere. And the third dimension is the plot. Something has to happen. And the fourth dimension is the style. You're telling the story in words. And finally, the fifth dimension is the theme. Every story has some, at least implicit, philosophical theme. So let's start with the characters. The two main characters of this book are called Lawrence Wentworth and Peter Stanhope. The words are invented and symbolic. Wentworth descends into hell. His worth went. Peter Stanhope is a kind of apostle or angel figure who stands on hope and mediates heaven to the main protagonist who stands between the two in making choices. That's Pauline and Strutter. Pauline is initiated into some of the mysteries of Jacob's ladder, ways of ascending into heaven while on earth. Wentworth is initiated into some of the mysteries of Satan's ladder, how to descend into hell while still on earth. What happens in this book is a man goes to hell during his life on earth. Very strange thing. But then Williams is a master of strangeness. In one of his novels, All Hallows Eve, the two protagonists die on page 1. And there are no flashbacks. And the story is about this world. How did that one out? In another of his novels, The Place of a Lion, the protagonists are Platonic ideas, which incarnate themselves with appalling power in this world. I know of no novel ever written that's like that. Pauline is introduced in the first page as a troubled, joyless woman, basically good, but full of fears. And she has a nightmare, a recurring nightmare, which apparently Goethe also had, of her own doppelganger, that is, her own dark side, her own ghost self. And it gets closer and closer in each dream. And she knows that when it gets so close that it touches her, she will die. She's terrified. And nothing can remove this fear from her. Until Peter Stanhope comes and says, haven't you ever heard of the way of exchange? What is the way of exchange? Well, it's something that Williams taught in many of his works, which C.S. Lewis, his best friend, apparently actually practiced at the hospital bed of his dying wife, Joy, through the mediation of a priest. I'm not sure exactly what the roles of each of these persons are, but when he was there, the pain left her legs and entered his. Stanhope asks, haven't you heard that we ought to bear one another's burdens? Pauline said, but that means, I know, you think it means listening sympathetically and thinking unselfishly and that sort of thing. Well, I don't say a word against all that, but it's more like carrying a parcel instead of someone else. To bear someone else's burden is precisely to carry it instead of. If you're still carrying yours, I'm not carrying it for you, however sympathetic I may be. Now, at this point, Pauline is not explicitly a Christian, and this is, of course, a Christian theme, because this is the theology of the atonement. This is what Christ did for us. So Peter says, well, there's no need to introduce Christ unless you wish, but it's a fact of experience. If you give a weight to me, you can't be carrying it yourself. So all I'm asking you to do is notice that blazing truth. It doesn't sound very difficult. And if I could, she said, if I could do this, whatever it is you mean, would I? Would I push my burden onto someone else? No, not if you insist on making the universe for yourself, he answered. If you want to disobey and refuse the laws that are common to us all, if you want to live in pride and division and anger, you can. But if you will be part of the best of us and live and laugh and be ashamed with us, then you must be content to be helped. You must give your burden up to someone else. And then you must carry someone else's burden for them. I have made the universe. It isn't my fault, but I'm sure that this is the law of the universe. And not to give up your burden is as much to rebel as not to carry on others. So we all should be a burden to our families. One of our tasks. I remember the first time I taught this book, 2 students came up to me afterwards. They said, "Do you believe this stuff?" I said, "I have no reason to disbelieve it. Why do you ask?" "Well, we were talking about the book, and we each have a psychological burden, and we didn't think that anybody else could carry it for us, but now we hope that it might be true." And they made sure no other students were around because it was rather embarrassing. One rather mature and attractive and confident woman said, "Well, my burden is I have fear of flying. And I have a very prestigious job, and it requires flying, and I have to quit my job. I don't know what else to do." And then the man said, "Well, mine is even more embarrassing. I'm afraid to take a bath because I think I might go down the drain." So I just have to wash myself with a washcloth, and sometimes that isn't adequate. Could we exchange burdens? Since she's not afraid of going down the drain and I'm not afraid of flying, then maybe when she's afraid of flying, she could just call me up and say, "I have to take a flight," and I could say, "Okay, I'll be afraid for you." And when I have to take a bath, I'll call her up, and she said, "Okay, I'll be afraid of going down the drain with you because we have enough imaginative sympathy to do that. Do you think it could work?" I said, "I see no harm in trying it. I don't know." The next day they came to class with big smiles. He had taken a bath every day, she had taken a couple of flights. Can this be done? Can we exchange each other's burdens? Well, of course. Oh, well, we can carry each other's suitcases, yes, but is there such a distinction between the laws of matter and the laws of mind? Is there such a split between the 2 dimensions of the universe that we can't do that in the mental and emotional dimension? Why should there be? And when we do it, what is it like? Well, as Charles Williams writes, when Pauline does give Peter her burden, he bore it, and the burden was inevitably lighter for him than for her, for the rage of a personal resentment was lacking. He endured her sensitivity, but not her sin. The substitution there, if indeed there is a substitution, is hidden in the central mystery of Christendom, which Christendom itself has never fully understood, nor can. Since he could not take, nor would have admitted her hate and rejection, her passion was received into the lucidity and peace of his own spirit. Well, that's what goes on between those 2 characters. Not only does he bear her burden, she then finds that she has to bear someone else's burden. And it turns out to be a member of her family who died centuries before as a martyr. And the records of his martyrdom show great sanctity. So they set him at the stake and put fire to the wood, and as the fire got hold of him, he gave a loud cry and said, "I have seen the salvation of my God." And he spoke this many times until he died, which was held for a testimony that the Lord had done great things for him there in the midst of the fire. And the place was called Brother's Salvation for many years. This is a story which went around her family. She knew this. But one day she received a vision from this martyr ancestor across the centuries of time, confessing that he is terrified of fire, and he knows that tomorrow, when he is scheduled to be burned at the stake, he will blaspheme, and he will say anything to avoid the fear. He's praying in prison, "Lord God, I cannot bear the fear of the fire." Pauline hears this, and she offers to bear it for him. And he thinks that she is an angel of God. And in a sense, she is. That's her job. She's a messenger. And it works. It happens. Her own voice said, burden to me, John Strother. He heard it in his cell in chains, as the first dawn of the day of his martyrdom broke beyond the prison. It spoke and sprang in his drained heart, and drove the riotous blood again through his veins. Give it to me, John Strother. He stretched out his arms again. He called, Lord, Lord. It was an adoration. It accepted. Pauline heard it, trembling, for she knew what stood behind her, and spoke. It said again, give it to me. He fell on his knees, and in a great roar of triumph he cried, I have seen the salvation of my God. If that sounds strange, it shouldn't, if we understand what happened in the Gospels. Unless we understand that as a freak, an exception, something that has very little relevance to our lives. If Christ is thoroughly human, he reveals to us not merely who God is, but who man is. And perhaps man is not simply I, but we, like God. And in that case, the relations between us are much more mysterious and much more intimate than we can possibly imagine. Both of these people are troubled souls. We're all troubled souls once we stop fooling ourselves. Pauline is an unhappy girl, good but unhappy. And that very unhappiness is used as part of the exchange. It gives joy to her ancestor. It had been her incapacity for joy that till now had turned the vision of herself aside. She knew that all acts of love are the measure of capacity for joy. So she offered her joy to her betrayed ancestor. She had lived without joy so that he might die in joy. She knew it now from the abundant grace of that place or that hour, but the exchange might be made between many mortal hearts without any knowing what work was done in that moment's divine kingdom. Well, that's the good news. The bad news centers on Lawrence Wentworth, the character who descends into hell. And his hell is not a Dante-esque hell, that is, when Dante is misinterpreted as not allegory but literal. If you're interested in the details of hell, don't read Dante. If you are interested in the details of the road to hell, read Dante. But this hell is a rather modern psychological hell, which I think is quite theologically accurate, because one of the saints, I forget who, said that I don't believe there's literal fire in hell, because fire is a beautiful thing, and God created it, and it's very good, and there's nothing good in hell. So if there were literal fire in hell, I don't think it would be so bad, because the damned could then say, how beautiful your fire is, Lord. And there's something outside of them that they love more than themselves, or that at least that they can appreciate. So I don't think there's anything in hell but yourself. And I think the souls in hell would wish that there were such a thing as fire and an external torture, because the internal torture is always much worse. So that picture of hell, eternal and absolute loneliness, is the picture that you get here. It's both a more credible and a more terrifying picture. Lawrence Wentworth, of course, gradually descends into hell. Almost always the gradual approach is much more effective. One of the obvious characteristics of that road to hell is lovelessness. Wentworth had never had a friend or a lover, or been one. He had never, in any sense of the word, been in love. Yet, or perhaps therefore, his life had been quite pleasant to him. Sleep had all of his life been a pleasant thing to Lawrence Wentworth. He's contrasted with, he's a scholar, and he's contrasted with a rival scholar who, instead of cultivating his own pleasure and security, cultivates self-forgetful devotion to his scholarship, to truth. Aston Moffat, by now almost 70, derived a great deal of intellectual joy from expounding his point of view. He was a pure scholar, a holy and beautiful soul who would have sacrificed reputation, income, and life, if necessary, for the discovery of one fact. Wentworth raged secretly as he wrote his letters of refutation of Moffat. And he drew up his evidence. He identified scholarship with himself. He asserted himself under the disguise of a defense of scholarship. He refused to admit that the exact details of history was not in fact worth to him the cost of a single cigar, though it was his career. Well, that's a bad habit. And bad habits are dangerous because they're roads. And he continues to go down that road, making choices along the way, which seem very small. And yet appearance is sometimes greater than reality. When he discovers that it's his rival rather than he who has received knighthood, when he reads this in the paper, there was presented to him at once and clearly an opportunity for joy. Casual, accidental joy, but joy. If he could not manage joy, at least he might have managed the intention of joy. Or, if that also were too much, an effort towards the intention of joy. The infinity of grace could have been contended and invoked by a mere mental refusal of anything but such an effort, however minimal. It was also his duty. He knew his duty, he was no fool. He knew that the fantastic recognition would please and amuse the innocent soul of Sir Aston Moffat, not so much for himself, as in some unselfish way for the honor of history. Such honors meant nothing, but they were part of the absurd dance of the world, and to be enjoyed as such. Wentworth knew he could share that pleasure. He could enjoy, at least he could refuse not to enjoy. He could refuse and reject damnation. With a perfectly clear and instantaneous knowledge of what he was doing, he rejected joy instead. He instantaneously preferred anger, and at once it came. He invoked envy, and it obliged him. By the way, of all the 7 deadly sins, envy is the stupidest one, because it is the only sin that has never caused, in any human being in the history of the world, one instant of even false pleasure. It's really, really stupid. All sin, of course, is stupid. I'm convinced that we're all insane. This is my definition of original sin. Dozens of times a day, God offers us a choice between joy and misery. Here he says, I have 2 hands, not just one. And you have the choice between my right hand, in which is the secret of joy, my will be done, and my left hand, in which is the secret of misery, your will be done. Now, in giving you free will, I say to you, your will be done. Will you return to me the compliment, which is my right hand? And we say, you know, Lord, it's true. Every single time I've chosen your right hand, your will, I've experienced joy, deep, lasting joy. And every time I've chosen the left hand, I've experienced misery. So I know that's true. Now, you offer me the choice again. Gee, that's a tough one, God. I don't know. Let me try the left hand. Maybe it'll work again this time. Einstein once defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result the next time. We're nuts. And that's what's so scary about this book. It's about us. There's Lawrence Wentworth and us. Any single human being in history could go to hell. St. Paul himself worried about going to hell. Wentworth determined then and forever that he would hate that fact and therefore all facts. To hate fact, to hate truth, to hate that which enlightens rather than darkens. That perhaps is the unforgivable sin. Because no matter how good the surgeon is, and how good the hospital is, and how good the instruments are, you can't do any operation if the lights go out. Wentworth is also in love with a girl named Adela who does not love him back. And in a very strange twist of the plot, a false Adela was actually a succubus, an evil spirit posing as a woman, offers herself to him instead as his totally obedient companion. And of course he accepts. It's not, I think, ordinary, normal, or literal, whether Christians literally believe that demons could impersonate human beings in this way or not, I don't know. But it certainly is a very accurate symbol of the primal sin, pride. I'm God, I'm the center of the universe. Truth comes from me, not to me. Along the way, he becomes more and more obsessed with himself and rejecting of the world outside him. And he is offered opportunities to come outside of himself into the world of truth and rejects them, all small ones. But God gives you many, many chances. Christ even gave Judas a chance in the Garden of Gethsemane. Friend, why have you come here? He calls him friend. Even that didn't change him. His last choice, as a historian, he's consulted about a play and whether the costumes are historically correct. He's an expert historian. And he doesn't want to bother. And they asked him, are the costumes of the guard correct? In one flash, he saw that they were not. And at this point of decision, he could do what the honor of his scholarship commanded. He could have them returned. It meant only his being busy with them that one evening and concerning himself with something different from his closed garden. He smelled the garden. He said, yes, they're correct. It was over. He could go into the little enclosed garden, the garden of his own soul. To go from the characters to the plot, let's go right to the end of the book. Here is the picture of his final damnation. He simply goes to a public meeting that he is obliged to go to and sits in a chair and does nothing else. He would always sit there. He sat down. As he did so, he knew he was lost. He wanted desperately to hold on to the rope. He's had a dream of climbing down a rope. And he hopes that at the bottom of the rope he'll meet something interesting. The rope was no longer there. He believed that there would be for him a companion at the bottom of the rope who would satisfy him forever. And now he was there at the bottom, and there was nothing but meaningless noises and visions. The rope was not there. There were faces, but they ceased to be faces. They became blobs of whitish red and yellow, working and twisting in a horrible way that yet did not surprise him, because nothing could surprise him. He was sitting at the end, looking up an avenue of nothingness, and the little flames licked his soul, but they did not now come from without, for they were the power and the only power his dead past had on him, the life and the only life of his soul. He waited for something to happen. The silence lasted. Nothing happened. In that pause, all hope and expectancy faded. The shape went out, and he was drawn steadily, everlastingly, inward and down through the bottomless circle of the void. I told you it was a scary book. In the plot, Wentworth is contrasted not only with Pauline, who in a sense ascends to heaven, but also with a nameless suicide, who apparently is on the way to hell, but who is saved. Because God sees what's deepest in his heart. The suicide is described this way. His name no one troubled to know. He was hungry, he was ill, he was clumsy, he was slow. His life seemed to him an endless gutter down which ran an endless voice. The republic of which he knew nothing had betrayed him. That's a technical term for Williams. It's not a political term, it's a mystical term. The city. It's Augustine's Civitas Dei, the city of God. It's what the Russian Orthodox often mean by Sobornost, one of the key themes in Dostoevsky. It's the interaction and interdependence of all human beings in the world. Many of the Russian mystics say, just as the physical world is governed by universal gravity, so the spiritual world is governed by a universal gravity of souls called love. And if you touch any one soul, you influence all souls. you'll frequently find, if you read the Russian Orthodox mystics, statements like, if you go home this afternoon and do one little act of charity to somebody in your family, the result will be that 300 years from now, somebody that you've never heard of and never heard of you will receive enough grace to overcome his temptations or his trials. If not, not. And if you do one little act of uncharity to somebody that seems to be unimportant to you, then the result will be that 300 years from now, someone you have never met will repudiate the grace that's offered to him. Because everything touches everything, materially, and why shouldn't every soul touch every soul spiritually? So there are no victimless crimes. Just as in your body, everything influences everything. If there's an infection in your foot, the white corpuscle will rush from all parts of your body to combat it. If you have a stone in your shoe, you can't think right. Well, we're all one body. And whatever harms one organ harms all, and whatever helps one helps all. So there are no victimless crimes. That's Williams's vision. And that is really the setting of the story. The setting is London, and the setting is the theater, and it's realistically described. But the mystical setting, the cosmological setting, is the most important one. And in that setting, past and present meet. If the spirit of a man at death saw truly what he was and had been, so that a lucid power of intelligence manifested all himself to him, then that energy of knowledge was especially urgent upon men and women here. In other words, life and death interpenetrate. Life is a literal rehearsal for death. At a rehearsal, you actually do the thing you're rehearsing for. The neighborhood of the dead troubled the living. Wentworth's house is the very house that the suicide committed suicide in centuries before. So in that single place, these two times meet. Since the suicide sought that which Wentworth did not seek, namely love and companionship, though he did not find it, he was saved. He was offered at the point of death the salvation he was never offered during life and accepted. But he's shocked when he realizes, after he committed suicide, that you can't commit suicide. Suicide, like divorce, is an illusion. Something that seems to exist but doesn't. Something eternal cannot be killed. Persons are eternal. Both the single flesh that each individual is and the one flesh that a validly married couple is. He had supposed he had wanted to die, and only at the last he discovered that he wanted also not to die. But he also wanted not to live. And these two rejections blurred his brain and shook his body. By the latter, he stood still, holding on to it, utterly defeated at last, in a despair that even he had never felt before. There had always been present to him, unrecognized but secure, man's last hope, the possibility of death. It may be refused, but the refusal, even the unrecognized refusal, admits hope. I think it's Viktor Frankl, the great psychologist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, who says that he asks his patients who come to him deeply troubled, why haven't you committed suicide? And they say, are you advising me to do so? No, no. In fact, you have deliberately chosen not to commit suicide. Anybody can do it at any time. Why haven't you? And their answer is their life's meaning. There is some reason for me to live rather than to die. Without the knowledge of his capacity of death, however much he may fear it, man is desolate. And now this hope had gone. He had no chance whatever. The rope was gone. He could not die, for he was already dead. All cases that I have read about of people who have committed suicide and returned, whether through CPR or some other medical means, have said the same thing. Namely, that they tried to escape that which they could not escape. And if they had this full vision, as this man had, then they realize that mistake and they don't try it again. But even if horizontally souls are dependent on other souls in this intimate way, how can the verticality of time work that way? How can the past and the present work in tandem? On a horizontal road, you can go east or west, but on a vertical road, you can't go both up and down. So doesn't causality work only from the past into the future rather than vice versa? How could a 20th century girl, Pauline, cause something to happen in the 16th century to her own ancestor? How could causality work backwards? How can time work that way? Well, if you're dealing with eternity, you're not dealing with time. You're dealing with something else, something greater. When my youngest daughter was 6 years old, she was diagnosed as having a malignant and inoperable brain tumor, and they gave her 6 months to live. And we asked for miracles, and we asked for prayers, and we got them, and she's fine. She's 40 years old, she's a clinical psychologist, married with 2 kids. We got our miracle. But one of my students, who was a very bright and personable friend of mine, who was an atheist, I asked him to pray too. And he said, you know, I'm an atheist. I said, yeah, but God isn't, so he listens to your prayer. It is. So he laughed at that. He said, okay, I'll pray. To whom it may concern. After we got the miracle, I thanked him for his prayers. And he said, look, even if there is a God, you must know enough about the laws of physics to realize that my prayer couldn't have made any difference because you told me that they discovered at the operation that it was not the kind of tumor that they thought it was and that showed up on the CAT scan. It was not a malignant tumor, it was a benign tumor, a totally different kind of tumor. This was, the surgeon said, a tumor that she had been born with 5 years ago. So how could a prayer in 1975 have possibly changed an event in 1970? He was a very intelligent student. So I said, well, look, if there is a God, he's not in time. He's in eternity. So when you're dealing with him, you're not dealing across the board. You're dealing with eternity. All things are present to him. So why couldn't causality work, neither backward nor forward, but instantaneously? As you did when you wrote that brilliant poem for me that I gave you an A+ on. Didn't it all come to you at once? He said, yeah, I guess I was a little bit like God that way, wasn't I? Once Pauline realizes that she's living in that kind of world, a world in which we see only the scree, the scrim on the beach, we see just the surface. And there's immense powers happening behind the scenes. She's terrified, but wonderfully terrified. She felt a low but immense arc rising above the horizon of her world, or perhaps of the earth itself, the hint of a new organization of all things, a shape of incredible difficulty in finding, of incredible simplicity once found, the shape of an infinitely alien arrangement of infinitely familiar things. Her ancestor was not there. He was dead centuries since, if centuries meant anything, but perhaps they didn't. Perhaps everything was all at once to omnipotence, who therefore, when he steps into time, says, behold, I make all things new. That's my candidate for the greatest line in the history of cinema. You remember it from the Passion of Christ. Christ is carrying his cross and is about to change everything. And Mary is watching him in agony and doesn't understand why he has to do all this. And she says something like, why do you have to do it this way? And he looks at her and says, see, Mother, I am making all things new. Only eternity can do that. There are places, even in this world, that are haunted by the presence of the dead. Gettysburg, the Colosseum in Rome. Maybe the whole world is similarly haunted. Williams lifts up the curtain a little bit and sees and shows us a little of what might be, just a tiny bit of this larger horizon, which is very good, but at the same time terrifying. Like Aslan. He's not safe, but he's good. The fundamental theme of the book, I think, philosophically, is the absoluteness of truth and the redemptive power of truth and the choice between heaven and hell as ultimately a choice between light and darkness, not just morally, not just between good and evil, that too, of course, but also between truth and untruth, between objective truth and subjective truth, between letting God be God and playing God. Between not just saying, my will be done versus thy will be done, that too, of course, but identical with that, my truth or your truth. What Wentworth rejects is truth. And if there's any one candidate for the unforgivable sin, I think that's it. Because no matter what comes to you, if you reject everything that comes to you, if you reject everything but yourself, you're already in hell. In the last battle, you may remember, when the world ends and the true God, Aslan, appears, the dwarfs, who have no faith and no hope and no trust, sit there with their eyes closed, and they say the dwarves are from the dwarves, are for the dwarfs. And Aslan can't break through that. He shines the light on them, but they close their eyes and they're in the darkness. One of the saints says, I think this is St. Catherine, I suspect that heaven and hell are the same place. They're the light of God. But it tortures those who hate the light, and it blesses those who love it. Cardinal Newman has a sermon about that. He says, imagine taking somebody who hates beauty and hates the church to a high mass with magnificent music and making him sit in the front row for 2 hours of this beauty. It would be hell to him. And everybody else in the congregation is heaven. Some time left. So rather than go further into this theme, which is rather abstract and philosophical, let me just briefly mention the style. If you want to read this book, and you should, be prepared for a wrestling contest. It's not a simple book. First of all, it's mystical, it's visionary. You can't just look at it, you have to look along it. Secondly, you have to have an imagination. You have to have an analogical imagination. You can't be too literalistic. Throw away your computers and get out your poetry. But this is a book everybody should read. It's a shattering book, but unless your heart is shattered, it's not complete. I'm going to give myself the book at this point and ask for questions.
All right, Dr. Kreeft, first question is trading of burdens and descent into hell an illustration of Williams' doctrine of co-inherence?
Co-inheritance, yes. We inhere in each other. When somebody that you deeply love dies, not only do you feel deprived and perhaps even betrayed, but everything in the world seems to lack life. The color has gone out of everything. Why is that? A large portion of your life has gone, but the rest of it seems to also have been gone. Why is that? Well, the reason is that that person was a part of you. That person was your third eye. And now you look at the world only with your own eyes. and it lacks that sense of depth, that sense of perspective. A friend is not somebody that you look at, but somebody that you look with, like a pair of eyeglasses. And that perspective is gone now. And therefore the whole world is, in a sense, gone. Well, that's, I think, an empirical, experiential piece of evidence for the fact that we adhere to each other. And if that's true, if that's not just a psychological trick we play on ourselves, then that's something that God has put into the human situation to be used. Therefore, the fundamental commandment, love, is not just a moral ideal. It's a statement of mathematical accuracy. When Dante insists that Beatrice actually is the almost goddess that he makes her out to be, especially in Vita Nuova, as well as in the Divine Comedy, he says, this is not my poetic fancy. This is a vision of what she is. And unlike most romantic lovers, Dante was wise enough to realize that this was not individual and peculiar and subjective to him. This was a universal principle. If we saw each other, we would see each other as images of God. We would look along each other and see the light of God flowing through each other. I'm not sure it was Charles Williams, maybe it was, some theologian, said, if we only understood everything St. Paul meant when he ever used the word in all of his epistles, we would have nothing left to understand. We'd know all of Christian theology. I am in the Father is in me. We are in Christ, Christ is in us. We are in each other. That co-inherence is a fundamental principle in Christian theology, but it's mystical, and therefore we don't hear too much about it, alas.
Why do you think God created imagination in human beings? Also, how does imagination draw us closer to God?
Since we're made in God's image, and since the imagination is part of our spiritual soul, God must have done this because he himself has an imagination. He can be outside of himself and into us. One of the most debilitating of all mental illnesses is Asperger's syndrome. And one of the characteristics of Asperger's syndrome is the lack of the moral imagination. That is, you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes. How would you feel if somebody did that to you, what you've just done to them? The question is meaningless to someone who has a deep version of Asperger's syndrome. Well, that's a defect in the very image of God. So the imagination is not just some extra. The image of God is not limited to simply reason and free will. In fact, if you don't have an imagination, it's very, very difficult to be a saint. How can you practice the golden rule without an imagination? Do unto others what you would have, would want to have, can imagine, therefore, others doing to you. So it's a divine gift that we have a duty to cultivate.
Can you briefly discuss how the friendship between Lewis and Williams developed? And is this what drove a wedge between Lewis and Tolkien?
Yes and no. Lewis discovered Williams when he read The Place of the Lion. Williams was not an academic, he was an editor at a press in London. Lewis invited him to come to Oxford, and he thoroughly charmed a group of disciples and gave many lectures at Oxford. Lewis was deeply influenced by Williams, Tolkien was not, but that did not drive a wedge between Lewis and Tolkien. Nothing drove a